This game made over $150,000 on the first day of its Kickstarter. I guess that means I should check it out. And because they paid me to, this video is sponsored by Echoes of Astra, which is an anime-based card game where you play units, equip them with stuff, transform the battlefield with territory cards, and play one-off tactics that can turn the tide. Move your ready units into one of the 3 combat zones on the board. If an opposing player already has a unit there, then they fight. At the end of your turn, score victory points from all of your units in combat zones. The first person to reach 20 victory points victorizes. So what's our resource system in this card game? Well, once during your main phase, you can slap a card from your hand face down as a resource in the supply area. The old reliable at this point. Any card as resource. But after you do this in this game, you get to draw a card. Nice! Gold star for not being like Lorcana. You coulda done draw too. You coulda! Cards in this game have a cost in the upper left corner. Just turn the resources sideways to pay it and play it. Every card type also has affinity. This is the game's faction system. When building a deck, you can only use 2 of the game's 5 affinity. Ziz. Plus neutral. You can always run those. Then you got the fighty boys, the units. They got attack, they got defense, they got influence. Attack and defense, those are pretty obvious, but influence, that's the amount of victory points you get if the unit ends your turn in a combat zone. We'll get to that in a second. Equipment cards can also have these 3 stats, but as bonuses to the unit that they're equipped to. When you play units in this game, they enter exhausted, the sideways turn, in your staging area. This is like your home base. Don't worry, they'll ready at the beginning of your next turn, just like any other exhausted thing you might have. We also got our one and done cards. In this game, they're called tactics. Pay the cost, do what they say, then toss them in the graveyard. Some tactics are counters though, which means you can play them even on your opponent's turn, but only when they attack. Instants are pretty strictly timed in this game. As I mentioned before, there are also equipment cards that equip units and give them extra stats. Once played, they're gorilla glued to their unit until it dies. And when the unit does die, the equipment dies with it, straight to the graveyard with you. Finally, we got terrain cards. These can be played to any of the 3 combat zones, but they can also be played face down. If you play it face down, you don't pay for it until it flips face up, which you can do even on your opponent's turn with the same timing as counter tactics. Each player can only have 1 terrain at a given combat zone at a time though. This is also one of those big main phase type games where you can do anything you want in any order. So in addition to playing all of these card types, you can also send your units out to the combat zones during the main phase. To do this, pick 1 ready unit and move its fat butt to a combat zone that you don't already have a unit in. If there's no one there, congratulations, nothing happens. If there's an enemy unit there though, that's when we gotta start fighting. On the surface, the combat is very standard. Both units deal their attack as damage to each other. If a unit has more damage than it has health, it's dead. And damage stays on units until the end of the turn. However, there is a kicker or two. After battling, if a unit was ready, they become exhausted. And exhausted units don't fight back in combat. They're too EP. If both units survive the battle, the attacker goes back to wherever it was before it attacked. This little roux of mechanics makes taking the combat zones a fairly interesting set of choices. You could run in your big bungus and take the zone, but then it's open to counterattacks where your opponent could just run a little guy into your bungus to get rid of its ability to fight back, and then... But wait, what if I have the super special ultimate counter card that re-readies my guy and gives him extra attack for the turn? Yes, delightfully devilish. Now my opponent has to decide whether I have it or not. I have the resources open, and it's definitely not because I just didn't have any other card I could play right now. If you're worried about a unit getting dragoned in the face from a combat zone, you can exhaust it to retreat from the combat zone back to your staging area. They can't get you back there, except for when they can. Once you're done playing units and fighting it out, count up all the influence on units you have in the combat zones and add that to your victory points. Once someone gets 20 points, they win. And finally, to quickly touch on deck building, it's really simple. Pick 2 of the 5 colors, and build a deck of at least 50 cards where you can play 3 copies of any given card. That's pretty much the game. I can't really say there's anything mind-blowing about the mechanics here, but what they do have is very solid. I played a couple starter deck games and constructed games against one of the devs and never really thought, oh, this doesn't make any sense at all, or why is this thing the way that it is? It's a little bit more of a slower paced game from what I played. Even playing the more aggro red deck, most units only gave you 1 or 2 victory points, and they had to actively be in the combat zone to accrue those points. But maybe we were both playing pretty patient. I know there were lots of times where I'm like, I don't want to move this guy out because next turn I'll be able to play this guy and then he can do this thing and that other unit can do this other thing and I need to do both of them at once to get maximum value. But in the games that I played, we regularly went up to 14 or 15 resources, which is where any card as resource starts to get a little unwieldy with the amount of cards you're moving around. It was pretty fun to try and sequence out how my turns would go and then my opponent's next turn would go to see how the combat zones would land after a few exchanges. Sometimes you get a little scared and you gotta pull a guy back to your staging area so he's ready for the next threat and he doesn't get eliminated. Except for when he does! Most of the effects here were quick, clear, and snappy. If you're looking for long, convoluted card effects, this is not the game for you. The art is a pretty decent mix of waifus and things that aren't waifus, in a more modern fantasy setting instead of your regular high fantasy setting. Yeah, they got their elves and dragons, but also tanks and drones. And catgirl medics, hell yeah, now I just need me a robo kaiju. The team making this game, Parhelion Studio, has experience in the digital gacha world with their game Grimlight, which ran from 2022 to 2024, and it seems like it had pretty positive reviews other than some technical issues. And luckily, pieces of cardboard can't crash. When the game ended its live service, they didn't just shut it down all the way. Instead, they kept it as a local client that you can still play today. That's pretty cool of them to do. I think the real hardship this game will have to contend with is being compared to Riftbound, which has a somewhat similar gameplay loop where you play units to your base and then send them out to fight over different locations in the middle of the board. The Kickstarter for Echoes of Astra is now, though, so it's hitting a little earlier than Riftbound, and I think if Riftbound has supply issues as bad as everyone is saying they're gonna be, and they aren't fixed by mid-2026 when Echoes delivers, maybe it can sneak in and get a little bite of the Rift pot pie. I've actually seen a few comments from people that have played both and say they prefer the simpler and more straightforward gameplay of Echoes of Astra. Interesting. Very interesting. Overall, I think Echoes of Astra is a pretty solid game. The combat zones are that little bit of spice it needs to not just be another mana-ramping creature smasher Hearthstone Duel Master wannabe game, and the team behind it seem to have some good experience in an adjacent sector. Check out their Kickstarter in the description. I'm Tulane's the Card Game Crypt Man, and I'm out.